Chapter 11. The White Peacock.
Nayland Smith wasted no time in pursuing the plan of campaign which he had mentioned to Inspector Weymouth. Less than 48 hours after quitting the house of the murdered Slatin, I found myself bound along Whitechapel Road upon strange enough business. A very fine rain was falling, which rendered it difficult to see clearly from the windows, but the weather apparently had little effect upon the commercial activities of the district. The cab was threading a hazardous way through the cosmopolitan throng crowding the street. On either side of me extended a row of stalls, seemingly established in opposition to the more legitimate shops upon the inner side of the pavement. Jewish hawkers, many of them in their shirt sleeves, acclaimed the rarity of the bargains which they had to offer, and, allowing for the difference of costume, these tireless Israelites, heedless of climatic conditions, sweating at their mungery, might well have stood, not in a squalid London thoroughfare, but in an equally squalid market street of the Orient. They offered linen and fine raiment, from footgear to hair oil their wares ranged. They enlivened their auctioneering with conjuring tricks and witty stories, selling watches by the aid of legerdemain, and fancy vests by grace of a seasonable anecdote. Poles, Russians, Serbs, Romanians, Jews of Hungary, and Italians of Whitechapel mingled in the throng. Near East and Far East rubbed shoulders. Pidgin English contested with Yiddish for the ownership of some tawdry article offered by an auctioneer whose nationality defied conjecture, save that always some branch of his ancestry had drawn nourishment from the soil of eternal Judea. Some wearing men's caps, some with shawls thrown over their oily locks, and some, more true to primitive instincts, defying bareheaded, the unkindly elements, bedraggled women more often than not burdened with muffled infants crowded the pavements and the roadway, thronged about the stalls like white ants about some choicer carrion. And the fine drizzling rain fell upon all alike, pattering upon the hood of the taxi cab, trickling down the front windows, glistening upon the unctuous hair of those in the street who were hatless, doing the bare arms of the auctioneers, and dripping, melancholy, from the tarpaulin coverings of the stalls. Heedless of the rain above and of the mud beneath, north, south, east and west mingled their cries. Their bids, their blandishments, their raillery, mingled their persons. In that joyless throng, sometimes a yellow face showed close to one of the streaming windows. Sometimes a black-eyed, pallid face, but never a face wholly sane and healthy. This was an underworld where squalor and vice went hand in hand through the beautyless streets, a melting pot of the world's outcasts. This was the shadowland which last night had swallowed up Nayland Smith. Ceaselessly I peered to right and left, searching amid that rain-soaked company for any face known to me, whom I expected to find there, I know not, but I should have counted it no matter for surprise had I detected amid that ungracious ugliness the beautiful face of Karamena, the Eastern slave girl, the leering yellow face of a Burmese dacoit, the gaunt, bronze features of Nayland Smith. 100 times I almost believed that I had seen the ruddy countenance of Inspector Weymouth, and once, at what instant my heart seemed to stand still, I suffered from the singular delusion that the oblique green eyes of Dr. Fu Manchu peered out from the shadows between two stalls. It was mere fantasy, of course, the sick imaginings of a mind overwrought. I had not slept and had scarcely tasted food for more than 30 hours, for, following up a faint clue supplied by Burke Slatin's man, and, like his master, an ex-officer of New York police, my friend, Nayland Smith, on the previous evening, had set out in quest of some obscene den where the man called Shen Yan, former keeper of an opium shop was now said to be in hiding. Shen we knew to be a creature of the Chinese doctor, and only a most urgent call had prevented me from joining Smith upon this promising, though hazardous, expedition. At any rate, fate willing it so, he had gone without me, and now although Inspector Weymouth, assisted by a number of CID men, was sweeping the district about me to the time of my departure, nothing whatever had been heard of Smith. The ordeal of waiting finally had proved too great to be borne. With no definite idea of what I proposed to do, I had thrown myself into the search, filled with such dreadful apprehensions as I hope never again to experience. I did not know the exact situation of the place to which Smith was gone, for owing to the urgent case which I have mentioned, I had been absent at the time of his departure, nor could Scotland Yard enlighten me upon this point. Weymouth was in charge of the case under Smith's direction, and since the inspector had left the yard, early that morning, he had disappeared as completely as Smith, no report having been received from him. As my driver turned into the black mouth of a narrow, ill-lighted street, and the glare and clamour of the greater thoroughfare died behind me, I sank into the corner of the cab burdened with such a sense of desolation as mercifully comes but rarely. We were heading now for that strange settlement off the West India Dock Road, which, bounded by Limehouse Causeway and Pennyfields, and narrowly confined within 4 streets, composes an unique Chinatown, a miniature of that at Liverpool, and of the greater one in San Francisco. Inspired with an idea which promised hopefully, I raised the speaking tube. "Take me first to the River Police Station," I directed, "along Ratcliffe Highway." The man turned and nodded comprehendingly, as I could see through the wet pane. Presently we swerved to the right and into an even narrower street. This inclined in an easterly direction, and proved to communicate with a wide thoroughfare along which passed brilliantly lighted electric trams. I had lost all sense of direction, and when, swinging to the left and to the right again, I looked through the window and perceived that we were before the door of the police station, I was dully surprised. In quite mechanical fashion I entered the depot. Inspector Ryman, our associate in one of the darkest episodes of the campaign with the Yellow Doctor 2 years before, received me in his office. By a negative shake of the head, he answered my unspoken question. "The 10 o'clock boat is lying off the stone stairs, Doctor," he said. "NCO operating with some of the Scotland Yard men who are dragging that district." I shuddered at the word dragging. Ryman had not used it literally, but nevertheless it had conjured up a dread possibility, a possibility in accordance with the methods of Dr. Fu Manchu. All within space of an instant I saw the tide of Limehouse reach, the Thames lapping about the green-coated timbers of a dock pier, and rising falling sometimes, disclosing to the pallid light a rigid hand, sometimes a horribly bloated face. I saw the body of Nayland Smith at the mercy of those oily waters. Ryman continued. "There is a launch out, too, patrolling the riverside from here to Tilbury. Another lies at the breakwater." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Should you care to take a run down and see for yourself?" "No, thanks," I replied, shaking my head. "You are doing all that can be done. Can you give me the address of the place to which Mr. Smith went last night?" "Certainly," said Ryman, "I thought you knew it. You remember Shenyan's place by Limehouse Basin? Well, farther east of the causeway, between Gill Street and 3 Colt Street is a block of wooden buildings. You recall them?" "Yes," I replied. "Is the man established there again, then?" "It appears so, but although you have evidently not been informed of the fact, Weymouth raided the establishment in the early hours of this morning. Well, I cried. Unfortunately with no result, continued the inspector. The notorious Shen Yan was missing, and although there is no real doubt that the place is used as a gaming house, not a particle of evidence to that effect could be obtained. Also there was no sign of Mr. Nayland Smith, and no sign of the American Burke, who had led him to the place. Is it certain that they went there? 2 CID men, who were shadowing, actually saw the pair of them enter. A signal had been arranged, but it was never given, and at about 4:30 the place was raided. Surely some arrests were made. But there was no evidence, cried Ryman. Every inch of the Ratborough was searched. The Chinese gentleman who posed as the proprietor of what he claimed to be a respectable lodging house offered every facility to the police. What could we do? I take it that the place is being watched. Certainly, said Ryman. Both from the river and from the shore. Oh. They are not there. God knows where they are, but they are not. _there_. I stood for a moment in silence, endeavoring to determine my course. Then, telling Ryman that I hoped to see him later, I walked out slowly into the rain and mist, and nodding to the taxi driver to proceed to our original destination, I re-entered the cab. As we moved off, the lights of the River Police Depot were swallowed up in the humid murk, and again I found myself being carried through the darkness of those narrow streets, which, like a maze, hold secret within their labyrinth mysteries great, and at least as foul, as that of Parsifal. The marketing centers I had left far behind me, to my right stretched the broken range of riverside buildings, and beyond them flowed the Thames, a stream heavily burdened with secrets as ever were Tiber or Tigris. On my left, occasional flickering lights broke through the mist, for the most part the lights of taverns, and saving these rents. In the vale, the darkness was punctuated with nothing but the faint and yellow luminance of the street lamps. Ahead was a black mouth, which promised to swallow me up as it had swallowed up my friend. In short, what with my lowered condition, and consequent frame of mind, and what with the traditions, for me inseparable from that gloomy quarter of London, I was in the grip of a shadowy menace which at any moment might become tangible. I perceived, in the most commonplace objects, the yellow hand of Dr. Fu Manchu. When the cab stopped in a place of utter darkness, I aroused myself. With an effort, opened the door, and stepped out into the mud of a narrow lane. A high brick wall frowned upon me from one side, and, dimly perceptible, there towered a smokestack beyond. On my right uprose the side of a wharf building, shadowly, and some distance ahead, almost obscured by the drizzling rain, a solitary lamp flickered. I turned up the collar of my raincoat, shivering, as much at the prospect as from physical chill. "You will wait here," I said to the man, and, feeling in my breast pocket, I added, "if you hear the note of a whistle, drive on and rejoin me." He listened attentively and with a certain eagerness. I had selected him that night for the reason that he had driven Smith and myself on previous occasions and had proved himself a man of intelligence. Transferring a Browning pistol from my hip pocket to that of my raincoat, I trudged on into the mist. The headlights of the taxi were swallowed up behind me, and just abreast of the street lamp I stood listening. Save for the dismal sound of rain, and the trickling of water along the gutters, all about me was silent. Sometimes this silence would be broken by the distant, muffled note of a steam siren, and always, forming a sort of background to the near stillness, was the remote din of riverside activity. I walked on to the corner just beyond the lamp. This was the street in which the wooden buildings were situated. I had expected to detect some evidences of surveillance, but if any were indeed being observed, it was effectively masked. Not a living creature was visible, peer as I would. Plans I had none, and perceiving that the street was empty, and that no lights showed in any of the windows, I passed on, only to find that I had entered a cul-de-sac. A rickety gate gave access to a descending flight of stone steps, the bottom invisible in the denser shadows of an archway, beyond which, I doubted not, lay the river. Still uninspired by any definite design, I tried the gate and found that it was unlocked. Like some wandering soul, as it has since seemed to me, I descended. There was a lamp over the archway, but the glass was broken, and the rain apparently had extinguished the light. As I passed under it, I could hear the gas whistling from the burner. Continuing my way, I found myself upon a narrow wharf with the Thames flowing gloomily beneath me. A sort of fog hung over the river, shutting me in. Then came an incident. Suddenly, quite near, there arose a weird and mournful cry, a cry indescribable, and inexpressibly uncanny. I started back so violently that how I escaped falling into the river, I do not know to this day. That cry, so eerie and so wholly unexpected, had unnerved me, and realizing the nature of my surroundings, and the folly of my presence alone in such a place, I began to edge back towards the foot of the steps, away from the thing that cried, when a great white shape uprose like a phantom before me. There are few men, I suppose, whose lives have been crowded with so many eerie happenings as mine, but this phantom thing which grew out of the darkness, which seemed about to envelop me, takes rank in my memory amongst the most fearsome apparitions which I have witnessed. I know that I was frozen with a sort of supernatural terror. I stood there, my hands clenched, staring at that white shape, which seemed to float. And as I stared, every nerve in my body thrilling, I distinguished the outline of the phantom. With a subdued cry, I stepped forward. A new sensation claimed me. In that one stride I passed from the horrible to the bizarre. I found myself confronted with something tangible certainly, but something whose presence in that place was utterly extravagant could only be reconcilable in the dreams of an opium slave. Was I awake? Was I sane? Awake and sane beyond doubt, but surely moving, not in the purlieus of Limehouse, but in the fantastic realms of fairyland. Swooping, with open arms, I rounded up in an angle against the building and gathered in this screaming thing which had inspired in me so keen a terror. The great, ghostly fan was closed as I did so, and I stumbled back towards the stair with my struggling captive tucked under my arm. I mounted into one of London's darkest slums, carrying a beautiful white peacock.